Hello, everybody. I'm Wael Gamal. I'm a fellow, L'Ariam fellow at Carnegie Middle East Center. Want to thank you all for coming for this session dealing with the subject of economic inequality and disparities in the Arab world, inequality and development, the Arab 1%. We are delighted to have with us here Dr. Gilbert Ashkar, who is a professor of development studies and international relations at SOAS, University of London. Of course, the author of many books, including The People Want and Morbid Symptoms. We also have Lydia Aswad with us. She is a research fellow at the World Inequality Lab, specializing in the Middle East studies on inequality, and a PhD candidate at the Paris School of Economics. We have Dr. Maged Osman, founder and CEO of the Egyptian Center for Public Opinion Research, Basira, in Cairo, and also the former Minister of Communication and Information Technology in Egypt. The subject we're dealing with today has been causing a lot of debate for the last decade internationally, especially after the international crisis in 27 and 28. And the discussion has intensified after the what happened in the Arab Spring in 2011, and although the discussion of the Arab Spring, what caused the Arab Spring, what happened in the area, was a major issue with the discussion of inequality internationally, but the research done on the area, our knowledge of the inequality facts of the Arab world is very low because of data limitations and other factors. So it is very important to open the subject and discuss how different and how similar is the Arab world to the global trends. The 1% and opposing the 99% slogans were part of Occupy Wall Street movement after what happened in Egypt and Tunisia and the Middle East, and it draws us back to the famous quote by George Orwell in Animal Farm: "People are equal, but some people are more equal than the others." I will start by asking Lydia to give us an introduction to the situation of inequality in the Arab world within the global trends, especially that she was part of the work done by Thomas Piketty on the area, and she had already written a research paper on Lebanon in particular.
Thank you very much, Wael. Thank you to all for coming. So concerning the recent results on the evolution of global inequality, I will mostly present results that are available online and that are part of the World Inequality Report, which was produced by the World Inequality Lab. And this report was written by Thomas Piketty, but also by Lucas Chancel, Emmanuel Sez, and Gabriel Zuckman. And so basically at the global level, inequality has risen. So the top 1% of the richest individual in the world have seen their share of total income rising from 15% to more than 20%. And on the contrary, the bottom 50% of the distribution has seen its total share of income stagnating. So these are the results at the global level. But when you look at the different regions in the world, you also see that inequality has risen quite importantly, but at very different speeds in all these regions. For an example, in Russia, the rise has been very important, especially after the end of the URSS. In China, it has been slower, but the common pattern is a rising trend. And so where does the Arab world stand in this global picture? So there is an important specificity of the Arab world that we have documented, is that inequality seems to be extreme and these extreme levels are quite stable. So that's what we have called the world inequality frontier. The Middle East seems to define a world inequality frontier that is a frontier that it seems hard to overcome for any economic system. It's hard to imagine higher levels of inequality.
And how do you see the connection between the wealth inequality and income inequality in the Arab world if you compare it to the international trends?
Yes, so everything that I've said now is about income inequality. For wealth inequality, we know very little, but the Arab world. There is a big shortage of data. What can be said is that the share of privately owned capital, privately owned wealth, is probably higher than the wealth owned by the public, and this leads to important wealth inequality that translates to income inequality, but data are not enough to appropriately measure this.
So there is a reproduction process between the different kinds of inequality in the Arab world. Dr. Gilbert, you wrote about new patrimonial states in the Arab world. How this defines the context for the dynamics of inequality in wealth and income, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that it was in any way original to speak of neo-patrimonial states. That's very common in the literature. I think that what is original, I would say, or I could claim, is to speak of plainly patrimonial states that we have in the Arab world. At the very least, the 8 monarchies, and especially the 6 of the Gulf Cooperation Council, plus a number of republics, although this number has been reduced now with the Arab Spring and the rest to one, which is Syria, but these are states like Libya and Iraq under Saddam Hussein were also patrimonial states in the sense that you have ruling families owning the state, that is, considering and regarding the state as their private ownership, and the resources of the state, the institutions of the state, the apparatuses, I mean. And therefore, I mean, for instance, when you look at the wealth, okay, what is the meaning here of wealth? You may have a Walid bin Talal angry because Forbes, downgraded him from rank, I don't know what, something to 27. He protested, claiming to be richer than that. But that's because he is acting as a businessman. Now, where is the limitation of the wealth, for instance, of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman? Where's the limitation of that? I mean, we know that he can afford anything he wants. He's not interested in playing the role of a businessman, but his wealth is immeasurable. I mean, it's absolutely huge. In that sense, yes. I mean, because also the specificities of having such states in the region, that adds a lot to this general inequality. And I should also say that when we look at the Arab world, we have inequality between states and inequality within states. And both are very important. And it's true that part of the picture of the Arab world and part of the perception of inequality, because inequality is a matter of facts and data on the one hand, but it's also, and most importantly, I should say, a matter of perception and how people react to it. And that would lead to social and political consequences. So we are a part of the world where you have a few states competing with Luxembourg or whatever for the highest per capita GDP in the world. And states like Yemen, Mauritania, etc., are at the bottom, among the least developed countries in the world. But if you look at that, I mean, if you think of a state like Qatar or United Arab Emirates and Luxembourg, the GDP per capita, in the case of Luxembourg, that makes sense in the sense that the average citizen of Luxembourg benefits from the wealth of the state. If one wanted to be fair, you should divide the GDP of countries like Qatar, all that, by the citizens, because they are the only people who have some advantage of this wealth. And then you get to figures much higher than that, because a big part, up to maybe more than half the population are people with wages and salaries, I mean migrant workers, which are far below what we would consider as a very minimal decent wage. That's the truth. Well, you have part of the migrants, the expats, they changed the term when you get wealthier, who are in relatively good conditions, but the big part of the population is like that. So that's part also of very much part of this picture of inequality, which is, as you said, a frontier case, a borderline case. This is really the most, we are living in the most unequal part of the world, yeah.
You mentioned the political consequences of inequality. Of course, that some of the international institutions, at least the World Bank, is defending the idea that inequality had nothing to do with what happened in the Arab world. Do you agree with this? And they use the perception approach to try to explain what happened, not the inequality facts. Do you agree with that?
No, of course not. I mean, because of course we have to take inequality in the broad sense. There are various types of inequality, and all of them are important. Income inequality, wealth inequality, consumption inequality, these are the economic notions. But you have also, I mean, inequalities between regions, gender inequality, of course, which is a very important aspect of inequality in this part of the world. You may have sectarian inequalities in some countries, ethnic, national inequalities, and regions, which are at the same time regions of ethnic or sectarian minorities, or sometimes even majorities, which are underprivileged, if you want to, which are, and therefore feel as oppressed and exploited by the system. And if we look at how it all started, it started in a country and in a region where this issue of inequality and the sense of deprivation is most acute. That's the province of Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia, which is among those deprived parts of the country, by contrast with the coastal sections of the country. And this is a feeling of deprivation that had been building up over the years. And we know, those who follow the situation could tell you that there had been a number of regional explosions preceding the one in December 2010, which ignited the what came to be called the Arab Spring. In 2008, there was a major one in a mining region in the south, very south of the country, very deprived and all that. So that's very much also an issue of inequality. And you have also political inequality. In some sense, most of our, or probably all of our countries, don't even have a real political equality and I would say civic equality. I mean, this basic slogan of the democratic revolution in Europe in the 18th century, we still have societies with two-tier or even more, with people with privileges and people not. We still have even apartheid situation, like is the case, for instance, for the Palestinians in Lebanon. That's a blatant case of inequality and injustice. So, I mean, there are, so to say that no, you cannot, definitely not disconnect what I mean, the big explosion of 2011 with all these types of inequality that characterize this part of the world.
Dr. Gilbert described some of the other elements and factors of inequality. It is a sophisticated phenomena and has many factors and elements. Dr. Magid, you have been working on developing an approach to measure social justice according to different factors concerning inequality. Can you give us an idea on that?
Thank you. Well, I think when we look at inequality, it's not a matter only of money. It's not a matter of wealth and income only, because there is other aspects that need to be also considered and analyzed. I think the part that is mainly social and cultural are in many cases are not really well analyzed as the economic part. And I think it's not only a matter of money, it's not only a matter of wealth or income, it's also a matter of, for example, from which family you are coming, from which tribe you are coming in some part of the Arab world, but also your class, your occupation, the occupation of your parents, etc. There is a sort of very sophisticated mosaic that is representing the social and cultural aspect that is playing an important role when you look at the manifestation of inequality in the Arab region. But also it's important to understand it, to understand the extent of inequality and how to face inequality. And in my work, I was trying to sort of analyze the issue of social justice by trying to measure two aspects. The first one is human capital, and by human capital it includes health, education, access to information, etc. But also social and cultural capital, and this includes trust, it includes participation, it includes, I mean, all those kind of other aspects that are usually not really measured when we focus only on the physical part or the materialistic part. But it's very important also to understand the causes and to understand the interaction that is happening, because if you are from a certain family, from a certain milieu, from a certain entourage, from a certain tribe, from a certain occupation, or your families are, or your parents are belonging to this inner circle, I would say, you have a better chance to get a better job, a decent job, which will not be the same case for the same, for a very similar person in terms of merit, in terms of education, but you can get a better opportunity and a better job, for example, when we talk about employment. But if you got this job, you will accumulate more wealth and more income, and then it will continue to be like that. And actually, it's going to be inherited from one generation to the other. It's very complicated, but we need to understand also the non-economic aspects that are encompassed in inequality.
Back to you, Lydia. We're talking here about the richest 10% or even the 1%. Do we exactly know who are the Arab 1%? can we really describe who they are and how they got to be in that category?
Yes, completely. In our work with Facundo Alvaredo and Thomas Piketty on measuring inequality at the regional level, we actually found that the 1% of the Arab are mostly in the Gulf countries, without surprise. I mean, there is no doubt about it, because the main driver of these extreme levels of inequality are inequality between countries, and more specifically, inequality between Gulf countries, oil-rich countries, and inequality between population-rich countries, as Egypt. And, but there is also large inequality within countries that we are trying to, that we think are still estimated, but that we are trying to include in the analysis. And in particular, in Gulf countries, as Gilbert was saying, the important share of migrant workers leads to important within countries inequality in the Gulf. And their share is increasing. In Qatar, for an example, they represent about, almost 90% of the population, and of course they have and they take a very smaller share of the total income compared to nationals, and this leads to a higher inequality.
You got the opportunity for having the income tax data for Lebanon in particular, which usually makes the measurement of inequality more accurate. What are the results? How can you describe the Lebanese 1%?
Yes, so moving from the Lebanese, yes, so in the fiscal data you can identify the richest individuals. So the Lebanese fiscal data I could obtain is an individual database. So for basically every individual you can see the amount of income he or she received and the amount of tax she paid on this income. So you can see what they own. Of course, we cannot identify them. I mean, if one of you is among them. And so what we see in the data is that the top 1% Lebanese mostly has income from rents. So after, of course, business income, and after, of course, there is very few that earns labor incomes. But this is very imperfect. When I say it's the top 1%, it's the top 1% that I can observe in the data. The problem is that in my data, I do not have a big part of capital incomes, namely dividends, interest, and probably the richest own this kind of income. So what I observe is just a partial picture, maybe just the top of the iceberg. And but for what we have, we see that rents are the biggest part.
How much does the 1% in Lebanon own our capture of the income, the total income?
So the top 1% income share in Lebanon is approximately 25% of the total national income. A quarter accrues to the top 1%, which is an extreme level. Lebanon is among the countries with the highest level of inequality in the world, just below South Africa and Brazil, like with comparable levels. And for the top 10%, it's of almost 55% of the total national incomes, which is also among one of the highest levels in the world.
Dr. Gilbert, how do you see the political influence of the richest 1% in the Arab world? How do you think they control the public policies? They control the state, as some of the theories suggest, theories like state capture and the like?
Well, I'm not sure I would put it in terms of 1% and 99%. It doesn't work like this. It's fine for statistical comparisons and all that, but I would rather put it in terms of social categories, social groups, and we have very very hierarchical kind of social system, of course. And we have a type of capitalism which is all over the region of the crony type. It's a crony capitalism. It's characterized by nepotism, by the fact that business is not run according to any market laws and competition and the rest, but is mostly determined by the political connections that you have. And every citizen of this part of the world, they know that, you know. And that's how, for instance, you can see that in many Arab countries, if not all Arab countries actually, among the richest people are people who are involved in the telecom business and the mobile business, because this is par excellence, if you want, a kind of politically determined rent producing sector. You need, I mean, the state gives you the license, so it's through your connection to the state, and that's how you have, you know, you look at everywhere, you will find, I mean, among the richest, you'll find people like that. So that's very much part of the whole thing. That is, there is a whole class in society, and within that class, I would say even a fraction of this class, a layer of people who control the state and who exploit the state, who use the state, their entourage, their relatives, their friends, their cronies, you know, to build huge fortunes. The case of Egypt that you know better than I know, well, is a very clear illustration of that in a state which is not a patrimonial state, because Egypt is a state which is where the backbone, the real backbone, is an institution. It's the military. And the military, we get into a different kind of problem. But even there, we could see how the political power, that's a neo-patrimonial kind of situation. With nepotism and all that, you could see how the family of the president became the most important, and the entourage of the president became the most important, the wealthiest and the most important economic groups of the country. So that's definitely very, very relevant to all that.
That's
and
related to Mubarak more.
Sorry?
You are relating this to Mubarak area.
Yes, I'm speaking of how it was, but I think the nature of the system is there. It's the same, because this lack of democracy, which is general to the Arab world, lack of citizen control, no means of control by the citizens over the state, over the economy and the rest, that produces these situations.
Dr. Magid, there has been a huge change in demographic trends in the Arab world for the last decade. And of course, there's the migration issues. How does this phenomena affect the inequality state?
Thank you for this important question. Actually, if we look back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the Arab world witnessed a demographic transition with different aspects from one country to the other, but generally fertility dropped and mortality dropped, but fertility dropped slower than mortality. Then this ended with a huge increase in the population size. It happened all over the Arab countries with very few exceptions. However, the implication of this population increase on inequality should be also well analyzed, because actually, in a matter of fact, high fertility is higher among the poorer or the less affluent part of the population than the proportion of people who belong to the below middle class or below are increasing in the society, and this is putting more pressure on providing services, basic service to everybody, and it is contributing indirectly to inequality. But what happened in the last 10 years, and let me mention especially countries who witness a political turmoil in the last 10 years, it is different because now we are talking about another aspect of demographic transition, which is a huge displacement in terms of forced migration, etc. And we are not sure what will have, what will be the demographic behavior of displaced population. Probably there will be an increase in infant mortality and mortality in general, maternal mortality, but we are not sure about fertility, how it's going to act. There is a few studies on camps of refugees that are showing that usually fertility, for example, among Syrian is higher than fertility among Lebanese within Lebanon. But this is just few studies, but we need more studies to understand what's happening. But let me mention two examples of Egypt and Tunisia, where the fertility started to increase in the last 10 years. And the increase in fertility is also contributing to a different balance of the population, because you have now the higher fertility, the high fertility is happening among the lowest income group probably. And with what happened of political instability in the two countries during the 2010 and 11, of course the delivery of basic service was down, and probably this affected the poor more than the rich. And I think we are also going to witness an impact of demographic transition on inequality. Of course, the impact will be negative. And we have to take care of that, because this is also a dimension that was not captured enough in policy, in public policy in the Arab region.
If we look into the measuring inequality that before and after the Arab Spring, the estimation show that before the Arab Spring, their inequality was getting better in most of the Arab countries. And the opposite happened after 2011. How do you see the explanation for that? And some people, especially some people, are connecting the change to the IMF kind of policies that penetrated through at least Egypt and Morocco and Tunisia and Iraq and Jordan, and that's the reason behind the worsening of inequality in Arab countries. How do you see the connection between international aspects of inequality and external and internal aspects of dynamics of inequality in the Arab world?
You mean the role of the international financial?
To what extent it's driven by external factors rather than internal factors?
It's obviously a combination of both. But the fact is that the international financial institutions, I mean the IMF, followed by the World Bank, but the IMF is the main actor in this regard, are pushing for policies which can only increase the social problem and increase economic inequality. And the idea behind that is the neoliberal dogma that you need some increase in inequality, and sometimes they say it blatantly, even for a country like Egypt, in order to have development, and that eventually this will trickle down on the rest of society. When the rich get richer, then at some point this will trickle down, and the whole society will get better. And you have ideas like the shock therapy, which is applied now in Egypt in November 2016, the measures that Sisi took for the first time, the most radical implementation of IMF recipes in a country like Egypt, and I always say you get the shock but not the therapy, actually. And that's the reality. I mean, you had a terrible effect of that on the standard of living of the masses. The inflation and all that got completely, the purchasing value of the Egyptian pound collapsed. All this affected very badly the standard of living of people, and of course, one can safely bet that this won't solve the economic problem of Egypt, because the issue is that the idea that the private sector should be the driving force of development, and that what you only need to do is to remove every kind of fetters, every kind of regulation that are regarded as obstacles to the free enterprise and all that, and then you'll get miracles. This idea is basically flowed, not in general, I'm not discussing it in general, in the Arab context of unpredictability, of the total absence of rule of law, also unpredictability of the environment, of the regional politics, of Iran, United States, Israel, whatever, all these sources of tensions. To imagine that private capital will go for heavy investment, long-term heavy investment, is a total illusion. Private capital will just seek quick profit. That's what we have. The vast majority of investment of private activity in our part of the world goes to quick profit. Real estate speculation is a major sector of the Arab economies. Construction and real estate, everything related to that, because this is basically also a rentier kind of perspective. But that's what you get. And the issue is that in the Arab world, we had, in the 60s, a much faster kind of economic development and a much truer one, with a lot of social gains and a massive reduction of inequalities. If you take the change in the Egyptian society or any of most of the societies in Tunisia also had even its socialist phase in the 60s. With a lot of measures going in that direction. And the rhythms of growth were much higher than what happened later. What happened later is a major decrease in public investment, with the idea that you should reduce the state to its simplest expression. And by the way, the IMF has never put pressure on countries to reduce military and police expenditure. There's that's a major part of the public expenditure in this society. So the idea is you reduce all that and you just let private capital do it. It doesn't work. It has produced what we have, because what we have is the result of decades of very slow growth, even 2 decades of negative growth per capita, the 70s and the 80s, because the demography was going faster than economic growth. And we have the lowest rates of growth of all regions of Asia and Africa, and the highest rates of unemployment, especially youth unemployment, and women's unemployment, female unemployment. These are by far much higher in the Arab countries than in the rest. So all this is part of that. And the most astounding is that the IMF, the only lesson they drew from the big uprising of 2011 is that you need more of the same. Is that, well, this happened because you didn't apply our recipes in full. And that's what they told Tunisia, what they told Egypt, and of course, in the case of Egypt, Sisi, as I said, is the most radical, November 2016, the most radical implementation of those. But this is also the best illustration, I would say, of the fallacy of the idea that this neoliberal perspective fits democracy. Actually, you need to implement what what we have seen in Egypt in November 2016, a dictatorship. and a climate of terror in the country, which is how it passed. Because all previous governments tried to implement and implemented part of these measures, but they had to do them quite slowly or even to backtrack, sometimes like Sadat in 77 or Morsi during his period. So that's the point. That's very much part of the picture, and indeed the international institutions bear a huge lot of responsibility in the present situation, of course in conjunction with the local elites that profit from this very sorry situation.
Dr. Magid, I want to discuss one of the pillars that were mentioned a lot, especially after 2011, as a strategic solution to inequality and social justice issues, which is education. Of course, after the adoption of the IMF recipes, we noticed that expenditure on education is not as high as it should be in a country like Egypt, for example. Even the constitutional limit that were put legally is not met yet. How do you evaluate the idea that education is crucial, and is it what other factors that can contribute with education in helping to tackle inequalities in the Arab world?
Thank you. Okay, if we would like to redefine social justice, it is social mobility. If you can provide people with social mobility, people can move from one class to the other based on their merit, then probably this eventually it will end to have a good level of social justice. To achieve that, probably the only way to achieve that is to have a good education for everybody. If you can provide kids of a poor family with a decent education, probably you put them on the right step to compete in the labor market. But we have to keep in mind that originally, when they went to schools, they are disadvantaged because, as you know, different families have different level of education for parents, and then if the first kid is his father and his mother are highly educated, probably they will give him more opportunity to learn, and if they are richer, then they can provide the kid with more resources. Even if you provide everybody with the same decent education, there is also part of the society that is in disadvantage. Then you have to be proactive and to give to the children of poor families a better even education or a better chance to get decent education. And this is not happening, of course, in all parts of the Arab world. The other way is done. For example, in many countries, kids of poor families are not, they cannot really go to preschool, and they go only to first grade, and then they are already in disadvantage, in multiple disadvantage, and then because the other peers who are from rich family, they will probably they went to preschool and they have more resources, etc. This is not really a fair game, and we need to think about not equality but equity, how to make people, how to achieve equity in education, because education is the only way to break this this situation. But also we have to think of other dimension than education, which is good governance. Because if we do not have good governance in society, probably all what is happening, the mess that is happening in economy and in other aspects of the society is leading the society to more inequality.
There has been a lot of proposals coming on the issue of inequality internationally and for the Arab region, even by the IMF that now acknowledges inequality as, I'm quoting here, the most defining phenomena of our time. one of the things that are proposed are tax restructuring, introducing some progressive taxations systems. Others are like introducing universal basic income as a way to decrease inequality. How do you see, Lydia, these proposals as an effective tool to really tackle inequality in the Arab world?
Yes, so of course there are solutions. I mean, otherwise we won't be there. I would mostly identify 3 of them, and I would say how they can be applied in Lebanon and in the Middle East as a whole. So the first point is the one you said. Tax progressivity is a very important tool to tackle rising inequality, and it has research has shown that it was very effective in reducing post-tax inequality, but also pre-tax inequality by decreasing the incentive of top earners to aggressively bargain on the wages they pay and on wealth accumulation. So in the case of Lebanon, what is the progressivity in Lebanon and how can we do better? So in Lebanon, there is a personal income tax that is progressive, that taxes progressively labor income and parts of capital income. But this personal income taxation is schedular, that is, it taxes separately the different type of income. So individuals do not declare their total revenue. They say, I earn this labor income, this wage, and after separately they say, I earned this rent from my property that I own. And this can create a regressive fiscal system in the sense that the more types of income you have, the easier it is for you not to declare your total entire income. So that's the first part. The second point is that, as I said, only part of the capital income is taxed progressively. But a large part, dividends, interest, are taxed at a flat tax rate and of 10%. I think, and it would be very important to introduce progressivity also in this part of the capital income. The third thing about the progressivity of the Lebanese tax system is that it relies a lot on indirect taxation, on VAT. And this actually, all what I'm about to say, can be applied to other Arab countries. So first, tax revenues, so revenues that come from taxation, is very low. It represents in Lebanon approximately 15% of the GDP, as compared to 45 or 55% in OECD countries. And within this 15%, you have 6% coming from VAT, so indirect taxation, taxation on consumption, 3% on income tax and capital gain tax, and 1.5% only of GDP that comes from the tax on property. So it's very low. So you see that VAT, indirect taxation, is the biggest part. But indirect taxation is regressive because it's mostly the poorest that bears all the burden of this tax. So direct taxation would be increased. The second point that is very important in Lebanon, but also in other Arab countries, is to fight fiscal evasion. This is very important. We need to have more transparency and more information on financial assets, and to be able to know who owns these assets. And because it has been shown that fiscal evasion increases actually inequalities, the richer that are more able to evade. So this has been shown by Gabriel Zuckman a lot. And so there has been some effort I think in Lebanon they proposed in September to increase exchange information. So let's see what they will do. But currently there is no automatic information exchange about financial asset and taxation. And also in Lebanon, it's very easy to create offshore company, and these offshore companies do not pay the corporate tax, do not pay any tax. I think they only have a fee of $700, and after they don't have any taxation. So it's really easy to evade, and I mean, you can read very often that it's kind of the national sport. So really tackling this is an important priority. And the third point would be exactly as you said, to invest in the future and to increase investment in education and health. And this, of course, needs money. It needs a state with a public wealth, with some finances, and hopefully with the increase of tax revenue from progressivity, from fight against fiscal evasion, it will be possible to redirect some fundings toward these more productive investments.
In the past few years, we have seen that all these proposals were debated in the Arab world, but there was resistance, political resistance, and nearly stopped the application of any reforms concerning the taxation system or else. Dr. Gilbert, how do you see the political condition when we think of tackling inequality in the Arab world at this moment?
I mean, I think that the region, I mean, that became obvious in 2011, if anyone had any doubts about that. But the region really needs a revolutionary change. That is a change in the social political character of government, social political character of the state. You can't just, you can't reform this kind of state. It's deeply rotten. And it's based on this kind of situation that we described. When I was speaking of citizen control over the state and real democracy and all that, I mean, part of it, you also have the state as the embodiment of the public interest controlling capital, controlling the economy. I mean, if you look at Western countries, countries like France, Britain, United States, the IRS and all that, you have tax services which are all powerful, probably. They can be tyrannically powerful, like in France and all that. There are no limitations. I mean, the tax service has more prerogatives, more power than even the interior ministry or whatever. Yeah, but that's something very important to be able to control the economy and let people pay a fair share, or whatever it is, defined by society, in a progressive taxation. You need a radical change of the nature of the state and of the control of the society over the state.
But this means that there is nothing to do until that kind of radical change happens?
You have to fight for these kind of changes. But with the knowledge that for this to be really implemented, you need, as they said in 2011, let's put it differently, تغيير النظام. إسقاط النظام يعني تغيير النظام. And you need to change the regime, the system. And people understand that the system is not functioning, it's rotten, it's blocked, and there is a very, very urgent need for a radical change in this regard. If this doesn't happen, and I keep saying that, the only prediction, if they ask me, how do you see the future? Aside from saying you need the coffee cup here to read the future and all that, but the only prediction you can do safely is that there won't be any stability in this part of the world for many, many years, and I would say decades to come. Because of all the problems that we mentioned, and because they can't have cosmetic solutions. You need a radical overhaul of everything. And that's what was put on the agenda by the Arab Spring, and it's still on the agenda. It wasn't solved. It will probably take a long time, but if it's not solved, we'll have more and more problems. Sorry to not announce good news, but yeah.
We know that.
Yeah, exactly.
Now we have 25 minutes for the discussion, so kindly introduce yourselves, and let's keep it at 2 minutes each, please, to be able to listen to. Yes, please.
Yeah. My name is. Stand up. Hello. Hello. My name is Navreet Singh. I'm a student at USA, VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University. And my question was, since you were proposing a radical, not reform, but from the bottom up, start from the scratch, would a revolution do that? Can you increase infrastructural power through a revolution? Because I could see a revolution happening, but I could not see how that would increase the infrastructure needed to stop fiscal evasion, to increase investments, to increase like taxation and put in a good tax system. So my question was, even if there is a radical revolution, could you put in the infrastructure with that?
Your question is for Dr. Jeremy.
Yes. That could be for everyone.
Very quickly, my point is the state is crucial to everything we're discussing, okay? And the nature of the state, the peculiar nature of the state, which is very peculiar in the Arab region. There are peculiarities for the state, distinguishing the kind of state that we have from those of other parts of the world. This is crucial to understanding everything here, how the economy functions, how society is, the inequalities and all that. And that's what needs to be changed. That's what I'm saying. And what is needed is a democratic change, obviously. I kept repeating this term, with installing a real control of society over the state, and therefore a change in the nature of the state, where the state would be reflecting those interests and the interests of society, a real public interest, and therefore having the power of that it takes. I gave examples from societies that are, not revolutionary societies today, but they have a past of revolutions, of course.
Yeah.
Just a couple of quick questions. Farah Sher from UNDP. My first question is probably best suited to be directed to Dr. Ashar. How useful and relevant is it in the Arab region to actually differentiate between publicly owned capital and privately owned capital, where we know, for example, in Lebanon, religious institutions' ownership of capital is not really directed towards decreasing inequality, the ownership of capital by the army in Egypt, etc. And then my second question, maybe to Lydia, whether in your analysis you've been able to identify new entrants, to the 1% in the Arab region, especially since you mentioned that most of them, the revenues are really rent-based revenues, which gives the impression that, we've maintained the 1%, the same 1%, the same 1% has been maintained for decades probably. So it's not like we have like new business elite. I don't know if you have anything in your analysis that can actually help us understand whether we have new entrants to the 1% club in the region. Thank you.
So okay, so actually, but private public wealth, but there is a lot to say. We don't have, as I said, data to measure the stock of wealth, but clearly, and I think Dr. Ashka will tell you more about it, in Lebanon, probably the public wealth is non-existent. It's mostly owned by private individuals. In the Middle East as a whole, the line between public and private is very blurry, especially in the Gulf countries. Like who owns, who received money from the sovereign wealth fund, etc., is not really clear. For your second question about new entrants, do you mean social mobility? Like how is it possible for someone to become richer and to enter in the top 1%? And whether this has been happening. Okay, so it's not measured, so it's not possible to track individual and to see the mobility. However, given the causes that you can identify from, like, for this high level of inequality, it seems that it is quite persistent, and probably social mobility is very low in Lebanon. But unfortunately, we can't track these individuals.
Yeah, very quickly. Again, it's a matter of the kind of state that you have. If the state itself is privately owned, then public means private. Okay, and that's indeed what you have in the Gulf countries and other places like that. And indeed, when you say, I mean, the army in Egypt, that's an economic sector. Well, that's public. It's not a private sector. Okay, but that's again a different story because you have a kind of caste situation, very specific to the country, and it has a history. It was part of the deal under Sadat in the denazionalization and liberalization of the Egyptian economy, and the way to divert the army from its political role. But of course, the consequences are not good in that sense. That's not the kind of state anyone would wish. So that's again why, for the public to mean something, you need a state that is really under, you know, the expression of the will of the people and the majority of the people, and under their control. Not only once every four years, but you should have mechanisms of control of society, of society over the state, and of the state over society, not only the bottom of society, but I would say even first and above all on the elite, the economic elite.
Add something, yes, because it's a very important question, because actually the dynamics of capital ownership and how capital is shared between private individuals or public and the state has been identified as the main cause of income and wealth inequality. And basically the rising trends I was talking about at the beginning is mostly due to a rise of private capital and a decrease of capital owned by the states. So of course in the case of the Arab world, as you just said, when you can't really identify it, or where probably public wealth is non-existent, it says a lot about the actual levels of inequality and what can be done in the future.
Yes, thank you. Nadim Haidar, just a student, a graduate student from AUB. I just wanted to point out a few things that I felt were a bit missing in this narrative that we were talking about. Is the imperial element of this story and the issue of Gulf capital. I'm sure people know, like, the works of Adam Hanif, for example, comes to mind. But one can't explain adequately, I believe, even if you refer to the state formation as Dr. Ashar does, without including in that story how these states were formed and why they're maintained and supported. And that includes long histories of imperial domination and interests, which are extremely interconnected to the Gulf and oil flows in the region, right? So this is what's more exceptional than anything, is that we have the whole global economy is centered on oil flows and continuous stable oil flows, which are connected to the American dollar and so on and so on. So one can't understand how all this is maintained or supported without factoring in the military bases surrounding the area and all the different interests who maintain these states, who created these states, and who installed them. So, so that's one, and therefore, this is an extremely crucial two factors. The oil flow and the imperial element are just not really I felt were a bit dropped off the story, which leads me to say that even if one wants to argue it's patrimonial or neo-patrimonial states, if one doesn't take a much more global, historical story that's inspired by, I mean, I'm sure Dr. Ashar is familiar with this, I'm sure, but I know, over concepts like Althusser's overdetermination or uneven and combined development. And we need these kind of concepts, again, to adequately understand why these specific states are what they are and the specific apparatuses they have come to become. Finally, just to add, the issue of climate change is also a bit unaddressed. And I also don't feel all these fixes that were, so quote-unquote fixes, whether it's education or fertility, despite any, I'm not going to even go to the theory, but there's no time. Like, simply, the climate is going, it's really going, and it's completely interconnected to the economy. And we're still talking about, give people some education. I have a master's degree, I still can't find a job, so, I mean, just saying. Okay, thanks.
I think we spoke a lot of the Gulf countries. If anything, we spoke too much about them, maybe, and can't really understand your point. If your point is to say to speak of the history of these states and all that, yes, of course. But any meeting like this, you can stand up and say, you didn't speak of this and this and this. Well, of course we didn't. We don't have time to speak everything. If you're interested in that, I wrote a whole book about that with all these issues that you mentioned explained in details. But now we are dealing with specific questions. This is about inequality. And when we speak of the IMF, by the way, the IMF is the agency of world capital in that sense, and mostly of Western countries. Okay, in the political sense of the West, not the geographical. And when we speak of this role, that's part of course, we mentioned neoliberalism, part of a general pattern that is imposed all over the world. So we are aware of that. We are aware also of all but we're not going to discuss in one session all the issues from Sykes-Picot to the military bases to whatever. We need to stick to the most relevant directly to what we're doing, and that's how we are trying to do.
Okay, responding to the last question about education, and you mentioned that the problem of unemployment is also there, even if you are highly educated. When I mentioned education, I didn't mention education and then I stopped. I mentioned also good governance, because you need the whole mechanism be changed, because it's not a matter of only educating people and not finding opportunity for them. And to do that, of course, the economy has to work in the right direction, but also we have to think of the role of the state in providing jobs, not in the traditional way of employing everybody in the government, but also in being a regulator to for example, to provide IT service, to provide infrastructure, to provide incentives for investment, etc., to make the environment itself able to generate opportunities. And this will not happen unless the government has good governance, but also unless there is a sort of control over the demographic factors that is playing an important role in increasing the youth bulge without having enough opportunity for youth.
Oh, here. All right, I'm just going to ask a question. Maybe you don't want a debate kind of format. So my question relates, my name is Malik Rasamni. My question relates to the idea of mechanisms of democracy that you guys talked about, and I have 2 points or 2 questions. One is, what do you guys think about the phenomenon of localization of, you know, see with Beirut Medinati, the emphasis on kind of municipal elections in Lebanon. We see the kind of much vaunted, among some circles, local governance councils that arose in Syria and a little bit in Egypt. So we've always thought of that the mode of progression is through these big centralized kind of states. Do you think there's a way to kind of have more local, do you think that a good direction to point to is kind of more locally oriented kind of governing structures that aren't just pointing towards these big entities? That's number one. Number two is, as far as the democratic controls are, we all have ideas about what we think the ideal society would be in the Middle East, and that economy, that government kind of controlling the economy. But at the end of the day, all we can really deal with is political liberalization. And when political liberalization happens, different parties step into the fold. And we saw the kind of the mechanics of how that kind of can unwind in Egypt much more clearly, for example, than in Syria, where it could never even, that process couldn't even begin. But in Egypt, you know, so how do we navigate through that? I mean, because, okay, the dictators, but then different parties come into the fore. It's not going to be clearly what we want. So how do we navigate through that trend without going back and just saying, give me the dictator again? So these two mechanisms, these two issues in terms of democracy and government. Thank you.
Okay, that's a very important question that you're putting. I mean, you're putting your finger on a really crucial issue. But that's why I think that's a major part of the story of the failure of the Arab Spring, is the absence of organized political forces representing the aspirations that were expressed in 2011. You know, people used social media and all that to circumvent their weakness, to compensate for their organizational weakness, and that played a role. That was not the only thing, of course. But ultimately, what you need are organized political forces able, you know, whether coalitions or whatever they are. I'm not speaking of a party, leading party or whatever. Forces that can lead this change. And in the absence of such forces, due to the fact that they were completely constrained by the existing regimes, what you had are oppositions that came to the fore, which were themselves connected to the Gulf system historically through funding and all that, and that tried to recuperate that. Now, what's the answer to that is, again, on the one hand, of course, to hope for the emergence of the alternatives, the alternative forces, progressive forces that can embody these aspirations, but also a radical democracy. And I think that the lesson of Egypt was very important, you know. That is the idea that I mean, we need a form of democracy that is even more democratic than the one that is dominant globally, worldwide, in Western countries. Democracy in Western countries is in trouble. There's a deep crisis of democracy, rates of abstention, and all sorts of things. If even you look at the Arab countries now, you see in the last elections, the abstention is dominant. Tunisia is a country that went through supposedly the successful change. 1/3 only of the voters participate in the last election, local election. We were speaking of local thing. But that's because they don't see the point. They don't see that this is going to change. They don't see an offer that represents their aspirations. And also what we had in the case of Egypt, that what I was mentioning, is this idea of having the permanent control of society over the elected. That is, if you're elected on a platform and you betray all your promises, the system where you stick to your place until the end of your mandate of 4 years or whatever is completely undemocratic. And you need the ability to revoke the elected, and that's what was done in Egypt at some point, except that it ended up with a military coup. But the idea of a petition is a very democratic idea. You find it in the history of democracies. You know, petitioning and all that, and the idea of the revocability, which exists in some countries, by the way, the revocability of the elected. So this is the kind of radical democracy, I would say, in my point of view, that is needed. And of course, a decentralized kind of government, because real democracy has to start from the local level, and that's it is at the local level that you can have the most democratic. I mean, we were discussing, we had a colleague here from Switzerland. The communes, the villages, the cities have much more power than anywhere else there, because it's a democracy which goes from bottom to top. Now it has been perverted by, by the kind of capitalism that you have there and all that, but it remains, in terms of democracy, one of the most advanced kind of democratic system in the world. So that's where I would look for inspirations, if you want, about the kind of change that is. Of course, it's a dream. It's a dream, but you know, all revolutionary changes start with dreams. Huh?
We have time for the last question. There is no last left.
Hello, Nizar. Can you hear me? Yeah? Nizar from Lebanese Center for Policy Studies. I have 2 questions, one for Dr. Maged. Do you have any evidence, any data saying that if you have good governance processes or mechanisms, you have higher employment, higher demand for skilled labor in any economy? Just because you mentioned it as like a causal effect, and I was thinking about it. The other thing is, specifically in Egypt and Lebanon, what do you think, whoever wants to answer this question, what do you think is the factor that is most influential in suppressing the politicization of economic inequality? So why isn't economic inequality politicized in the specific cases of Lebanon and Egypt, for example, or in the Arab world, if you have a pattern that you see? Is it more relevant to the opposition that doesn't exist, the democratic political opposition that doesn't exist, the ideological or class backgrounds of what's called civil society, or is it more related to maybe dynamics of sectarianism or the rule of military? I'm interested to hear your opinion.
I'm not sure I can bring now an evidence-based for what you mentioned about the relationship between good governance and what will happen later in terms of job creation and good economy. But at least if you have bad governance, it's not working. Let us try good governance, and why not? That is bad. Reacting to the second part of your problem, what I can see, for example, in Egypt, that any opposition at any point of time in the last 20 years didn't have any message or any understanding or any solution for the issue of inequality. They are only asking about social justice. And nothing is really very concrete in terms of what is social justice, how to implement it, and what are the options and what are the priorities. And I would like here to refer to a thesis that was conducted in the University of Zurich by German graduate students who studied the narrative of social justice in 5 of the icons of the different icons of the revolution of 2011 in Egypt, 25th of January. And she said that for the 5 those the icons that she selected, she said that the five talked in several occasions about social justice, but there is nothing concrete in terms of the definition or in terms of how to do it in the Egyptian context. And also there is nothing mentioned about what are the priorities, from where to start, and if there is any sort of good understanding of what to do in the near future and what to do later, etc. And related to that, I would like to mention one of the public opinion polling that I conducted in Egypt about how the public perceive social justice. I mean, the word of social justice, what does it mean for you? You can get a lot of different answers, starting from getting a job in the government for my husband, for example, ending up with keeping the subsidy for food and for energy. I mean, you can get sort of agendas that are very personally driven, because the political parties are not really announcing or describing what is social justice and what are the priorities and what can be done and what cannot be done. Thank you.
Yes. So, about why inequality is not politicized? Why is it not present in the public debate? That was your question. So, the first thing is that to be politicized, you need to know about it. And in the Arab region and in Lebanon also, there is a major shortage of information about inequality. When I started my study on Lebanon, the last comprehensive study about income inequality dated from 1960s. And there was no other official inequality estimates. The other study that existed was about consumption only and was focusing about the poverty, nothing about the top. So it's very important to know about this phenomenon, to be able to describe them in order to inform citizens and after engage into a political and public debates. So that's the first thing. It's important to improve access to data. The second things about the link with sectarianism. So I think, especially in Lebanon, it can be one of the reasons why inequality is not as politicized, is that the focus on sects may decrease the focus on classes, and that erase the social questions. And more, I think it would be something at the regional level, the trends and the bigger sectarian polarization at the regional level will possibly decrease interest and at least visibility or salience about social questions and class-based questions. And specifically about Lebanon, the sectarian system of governance also possibly leads to very conservative outcomes. That the possibility is that voters will maybe vote for a person from their own sect, even if this person they are electing won't do policies like pro-redistributive policies that would favor them. So a poor will vote for a rich from his own or her own sect because of this salience of sectarianism. And the last point, why the political class does not embrace the question, I think it's clear that they don't have an interest to talk about inequality, because I guess the 1% in Lebanon can be, I mean, political class and the political elites are mostly among them. So, but it's my opinion.
So we won't be taking more of your time. I want to thank the speakers and thank you all for coming. Have a nice evening.